Hello and welcome. I'm delighted you've joined us for today's Positive Link speaker series with Justin Berg, Becoming a Hitmaker, the Science of Repeat Innovation. I'm Monica Warline. I'm the faculty director at the Center for Positive Organizations, and so happy to welcome you to today's session. A few notes on our technology. This is a webinar session, so we do not have raised hand or audio enabled, but you can use the Q&A panel and please post your questions for Justin there as we go along. We do have live transcription enabled for this event, and you can toggle that feature on or off at your discretion using the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we're recording the event, and the video will be available at the Center for Positive Organizations website after the session. I'm delighted to thank our sponsors for the Positive Link speaker series, the Tauber Institute for Global Operations, the Sanger Leadership Center, and the Zell-Lurie Institute for Entrepreneurship. They help us bring these science to practice talks to you free of charge and keep our series going. And we are so grateful to them. We're also grateful to our promotional partners who help spread the word about our incredible speakers. Thank you, Ann Arbor Spark, the Managerial and Organizational Cognition Division of the Academy of Management, and the Organization Development and Change Division. If you would like to be a promotional partner, please reach out to us. We do have a co-learning consortium focused on the science of thriving organizations at the University of Michigan's Center for Positive Organizations. This is a vibrant community of learners and leaders who come together across boundaries of industries, generations, sectors, disciplines, intentionally to learn together about the kinds of science that we'll talk about today. And we would invite you to learn more and join us there. And today is a very special day at the University of Michigan. It's a University of Michigan holiday, essentially called Giving Blue Day. It's a chance for all of us who care about what's happening at the University of Michigan to show our support by sharing the stories, by getting involved, and by giving to the parts of the university whose work we support. So if you love positive links and gain from attending this speaker series, your gift would support our work at the Center for Positive Organizations. And we want to wish everyone else who is celebrating Giving Blue Day well on their journey, and happy Giving Blue Day to all of us. And with that, I want to introduce our speaker for today, Justin Berg. It's a very appropriate day to be welcoming Justin to Positive Links because he has a degree that is one of my favorite degrees in the whole world. And if I could go back and live my college life over, I would be a University of Michigan organizational studies student. So that's Justin started his academic career here at the University of Michigan with organization studies, who are also raising money for Giving Blue Day. So shout out Org Studies. Then Justin went on to do his PhD at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania and spent a decade as an amazing researcher, award-winning teacher, and inspiring figure at Stanford's Graduate School of Business. But this is like a celebration for CPO of Justin's coming home. He says himself that it's one of his academic dreams to come back to the University of Michigan as a faculty member. And welcome back, Justin. We're so glad to welcome you again and to have you back with us at the Center for Positive Organizations and at the University of Michigan. And we're just thrilled that you're going to talk with us today about some of your science focused on creativity and innovation. And we're so lucky to have you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for the warm introduction and for having me today, and for everyone joining today. It's an honor, and I'm really excited to share these ideas with you. So let's jump right in. I want to start today with what is perhaps the most famous family in American pop music. The Jackson family, pictured here in the 1970s TV show The Jacksons that made the family famous. Michael Jackson is in the middle row on the left side, surrounded by his many siblings. But I actually don't want to talk about Michael today. I want to focus on his sister, who you may recognize in the photo. Not long after the TV show ended, she experienced instant success as a solo artist. She got a top 40 hit on her very first try in her debut album. As you might have guessed, Janet Jackson is pictured in the front row on the left. But I'm actually not talking about Janet. I'm talking about her sister Rebby, who is in the middle row on the right. Rebby released her debut album in 1984, and the song Centipede from this album reached 24 on Billboard's Hot 100 chart, which is the industry standard for classifying hit songs. Janet released her first album around the same time in 1982 and also got her first hit song from her debut album titled Come Give Your Love to Me. It reached 58 on the Hot 100 chart. So Janet and Rebby had very similar starts to their solo careers, but from there, their careers took very different trajectories. Despite releasing 3 more albums, Rebby remained at one career hit song, Centipede. That was it. Janet, as we all know, went on to become one of the best-selling artists of all time with 41 career hits to date. It turns out that this isn't just a Jackson family saga. This tale of two sisters illustrates a ubiquitous pattern in creative industries. This pattern is often called Lodka's Law, named for the scholar who first discovered it. So Lodka's Law states that most creators will remain one-hit wonders, like Rebby Jackson, while only a small handful of creators will become hit makers with several or more hits, like Janet Jackson. This pattern has been found in virtually all creative industries, including among recording artists, film directors, book authors, fine artists, and tech inventors. So when I learned about how consistently we see Lodka's Law emerge in creative industries, I became fascinated with trying to understand what's going on here. Why is it that the majority of creators who have the talent and resources to produce a hit only do it once in their entire career? And what differentiates the small handful of creators who defy the odds and become hit makers who produce hit after hit while most of their peers remain stuck at one or maybe two? And when I looked at the scientific literature, I couldn't find a good answer to this question. So I ended up designing a very large scale study to see if I could find an answer. I decided that the music industry was an ideal context to look at the drivers of short-lived versus sustained success because music is a notoriously fast-paced, high-churn creative industry. It's a bit like a biologist studying fruit flies, so they can see lots of relatively quick life cycles unfold over time. The music allowed me to study lots of artists' career life cycles over time. I spent 3 years leading a team of data scientists to build a big data set that captures virtually the entire history of US pop music from 1959 to 2010. Our final data set includes about 70,000 artists and all songs by each of these artists, which was about 3 million songs total. So this captures all artists to ever release with a hit producing label, meaning a label that produced one or more hit songs. So all 70,000 artists in the data set were signed by a label with the capability to produce a hit. But despite this, only about 5,000 artists, or 7% of the total sample, had one or more hits in their careers. The other 93% had 0 hits in their whole careers. So although the term one-hit wonder tends to have a negative connotation in our society, being a one-hit wonder is actually a big and rare accomplishment. So the vast majority of artists never produce a single hit in their whole careers. And this shows how incredibly impressive it is to become a hit maker who manages to achieve several or more hits. So what do we find after analyzing this very big and comprehensive data set? We found strong evidence for path dependence, which is the idea that early events can limit the range of options that are available to you going forward. It's the idea that our possible paths to success in the future are shaped by what we've already done in the past. More specifically, what we see in the data is that an artist's path to sustained success depends on the creativity in their portfolio of songs at the time of their first hit song. So we scored the creativity of artists' portfolios in 2 ways. We call them novelty and variety. So novelty is how unique artist songs were compared to what was popular at the time. And variety is how much diversity or heterogeneity the artist had within their own portfolio of songs. Both of these dimensions of creativity predicted sustained success. In other words, artists who reached their initial hits with more novel or more varied portfolios were more likely to keep generating hits, while artists who scored lower in novelty or variety, meaning they had more typical or more homogenous portfolios, were more likely to become one-hit wonders and never have a hit again. So you might be wondering why having a creative portfolio was helpful for sustaining success. It's because artists need to juggle two competing demands after their initial hits if they want to maximize their odds of generating more hits. Their new songs need to stay related to their prior portfolio of songs, but also sound fresh and keep up with new trends in the market. So their new music has to sound like the past and the present at the same time, which is not an easy feat. It turns out that artists who reach their initial hits with more creative portfolios, meaning higher novelty or variety, they're better positioned to pull off this balancing act over time, which gives them better odds of achieving more hits. There are two underlying mechanisms driving this story: internal learning and external expectations. When you achieve your initial hit, you've gone from a low level of success to being pumped through the airwaves all over the world. At that point, artists are much more likely to succeed with new songs that are closely related to their existing portfolios because it exploits what they've already learned and what the audience expects of them. So internal learning and external expectations work together to tether artists to their portfolios at the time of their initial hits. But these two mechanisms are more forgiving to artists who reach their initial hits with more creative portfolios. When you start with novelty and variety early in your career, the learning and expectations that you set in motion are more flexible and adaptable than if you start with a more typical or more homogenous portfolio. And this flexibility makes it easier for you to balance relatedness and freshness over time, giving you a wider, more forgiving path to sustained success. But there's a catch. So artists are less likely to ever have a hit in the first place if they build a novel portfolio. Artists with typical portfolios, meaning their songs are similar to what is currently popular, are much more likely to have a hit in the first place. So there's an inescapable trade-off here. Artists cannot maximize their odds of being a hit maker without simultaneously increasing their odds of having zero hits in their whole career. The good news is that variety offers a partial remedy to this trade-off. So variety predicts both initial and sustained success. So this means that artists who build varied portfolios early in their careers are more likely to achieve an initial hit, and then they also enjoy better odds of generating more hits after their initial one. So artists can use variety to help offset the risks of novelty. What this looks like is building a portfolio with a wide variety of novel songs, as opposed to novel songs that are all similar to one another. So this strategy can't completely erase the risks of novelty for initial success, but it can help maximize your overall odds of achieving both initial and sustained success. To recap, what we've learned so far is two high-level takeaways. Before initial success, it's best to generate a variety of novel products. And after initial success, it's best to generate products that are not only related to your portfolio at the time, but also fresh, new, and cutting edge. So managing this balancing act over time is key. Now, you might be thinking, well, this is all kind of easier said than done. And I'm with you on that. So this study in the music industry focused on finished products. We looked at artist songs after they had been finalized and released to the market. But finished products begin as ideas. And you might be wondering, how do hitmakers come up with good ideas for a variety of novel products or for products that balance relatedness and freshness? To find out, let's talk about what many believe is Pablo Picasso's greatest masterpiece of all time, the painting shown here titled Guernica. It was inspired by the tragic Nazi bombing of the city of Guernica in Picasso's native Spain in 1937. Despite being arguably Picasso's single greatest work, it turns out he almost never painted it at all. Picasso was commissioned to debut a new painting at the 1937 World's Fair, which was set to begin in late May. He was planning to do a painting called Artist Studio. As we can see here, by mid-April, he was well on his way and had already sketched out his vision for Artist Studio. This was right in Picasso's wheelhouse. He had done many similar paintings before, and given that the subject matter was literally an artist painting in a studio, the idea couldn't be much more familiar to Picasso. Then the Nazis bombed Guernica, Spain, and Picasso was understandably distraught over the tragedy. He soon decided to scrap Artist Studio and pursue Guernica instead. Given that the bombing had just happened, this was a novel idea for Picasso and the whole world. This is the first sketch Picasso made in developing his vision for Guernica. As you can see, it's much less developed and more abstract than his vision for Artist Studio. It's hard to even know what he was thinking about based on this sketch. In hindsight, it seems like Picasso made the right call by scrapping Artist Studio and going with Guernica, which was the more novel and unfamiliar option of the two. But this is Picasso we're talking about, one of the most creative people to ever live. So is this just about Picasso's genius, or is there something here we can learn about creativity more generally? Let's start with what we mean by good ideas or creative ideas. So creativity researchers often assess ideas in terms of two fundamental dimensions, novelty and usefulness. The most creative ideas are high in both dimensions. They're highly novel and highly useful. These are great ideas because they're likely to be hits in the marketplace. Gmail, when it first came out, is an example of a great idea in this upper right quadrant. So Gmail turned our email accounts into searchable archives for the very first time. When Gmail launched in 2004, Hotmail, which was a dominant competitor at the time, offered 2 megabytes of storage, and Gmail offered 1 gigabyte, which was a 500x upgrade. When ideas are low in both novelty and usefulness, they're just bad ideas. This is Harley Davidson perfume, which appears on many of the worst product ideas of all time lists. It wasn't really novel because Harley just slapped their brand on an existing product, and consumer reactions showed that this was not a useful brand extension. I'll just let this image speak for itself. Incremental ideas are useful but not very novel, like updates to an existing operating system. So incremental ideas are really important drivers of progress, but they're not the breakthrough hits that great ideas tend to be. And then we have impractical ideas, which are novel but not useful. This is an image from an actual patent for knee skates. Again, I'll just let the image speak for itself. The research I want to share with you asks, what's the most likely path to the great ideas in that top right quadrant? My answer to this question focuses on what I call the primal mark, which is the first bit of content that people start out with when they're developing a new idea. I borrow this concept from ancient painting theories. The 17th century artist and philosopher Shi Tao wrote about the primal mark in painting, which is the first brushstroke that a painter makes on a blank canvas. The idea is that the first stroke is very important because now there's something on the page. So it enables and constrains where the painter takes the work from there. I wanted to see if this applies not just in painting, but in developing creative ideas more generally. So I ran a series of experiments where people were asked to develop creative ideas, and they were randomly assigned various primal marks as starting points. One of my favorites of these experiments asked university students to develop creative ideas for a new product for the university bookstore that would help students do well in job interviews, a cause close to students' hearts. Half of the students were randomly assigned a familiar primal mark. Specifically, they were encouraged to use a 3-ring binder as a starting point for their ideas, which is a product that was already available in the bookstore, and easy to imagine how students could readily use a 3-ring binder to prepare for job interviews. The other half of students were assigned a novel primal mark. They were encouraged to use an inline skate as a starting point for their ideas. The bookstore did not sell inline skates, and it's not something we'd readily associate with helping students do well in job interviews, unless, of course, the job was at a roller rink. So I had all participants' final ideas evaluated by both potential customers and managers from the bookstore. So what happened when people started with the familiar primal mark? They usually ended up with an incremental idea that was useful but not very novel. Their final ideas tended to stay close to the idea of a three-ring binder, as we can see in the example here. What about starting with a novel primal mark? Well, people usually ended up with impractical ideas like the recording shoe. Their ideas tend to be novel, but not very useful. So we appear to have an unfortunate trade-off here. Familiar primal marks send you on a path toward incremental ideas, while novel primal marks send you on a path toward impractical ideas. So are we just doomed here, or can we overcome this trade-off? We haven't talked yet about how people flesh out their primal marks. Perhaps we can get the best of both worlds by infusing novel elements into familiar primal marks or by infusing familiar elements into novel primal marks. I tested these possibilities using the images here. So the novel elements on the left were all things that the bookstore did not sell and that we wouldn't readily associate with helping students in job interviews, like Legos, a ladder, and a TV remote. The familiar elements on the right were actual bookstore products that we would readily associate with helping students with job interviews, like index cards, a highlighter, and a notepad. What happens when you infuse novelty into a familiar primal mark? Well, not much. It turns out that when you start with familiar content in mind, you get anchored. Your thinking gets boxed in, and it's very difficult to come up with anything but incremental ideas. But when you start with a novel primal mark and then infuse it with familiar elements, you give yourself a much better shot at developing a great idea and ended up in that upper right quadrant. Here's an example of a final idea from someone who took this path. The product is called Time Watcher. Here's the description they wrote. So you figure out how much time you have spent left in the interview just by touching it. Once you start, the buttons will disappear one by one every 10 minutes. By touching and counting the number of buttons left, you can know the time without being rude and checking your watch during the interview. I thought this was a pretty clever idea, and the bookstore managers and customers agreed. They rated it high in both novelty and usefulness. We can see that this final idea is quite different from the novel primal mark that the creator started with. When you start with a novel primal mark, you put yourself on a path toward a novel idea, but your thinking isn't boxed in as you travel along that path. This allows you to improve the usefulness of ideas by infusing what design scholars call skeuomorphs, which are familiar cues embedded in novel ideas that help people understand and appreciate the idea. One of the most famous examples of a skeuomorph is a computer desktop. When graphical interfaces were novel, the idea of a desktop was added to tap people's existing schemas of a desktop in physical space. The creator of the Time Watcher here leveraged the familiar form of a pen as a skeuomorph, likely inspired by the highlighter they were shown. Embedding the timer in a pen, which is a familiar thing to have in a job interview context, helps us easily understand and appreciate how the timer would actually work in practice. One of my favorite examples of turning a novel primal mark into a breakthrough hit comes from the Hubble telescope. In the 1990s, some medical researchers heard about the advanced imaging technology created by NASA for Hubble, which was designed to pinpoint specific stars. The medical researchers thought, that sounds a lot like the challenge of spotting abnormal breast tissue in mammogram testing. And they ended up partnering with NASA to totally revolutionize mammogram testing using the Hubble technology. The mammogram machine they created enabled much more precise needle biopsies, cut testing time in half, and reduced the price per mammogram from $3,500 to $850. A key is that they did a major familiarity infusion. They embedded the Hubble tech inside a machine that looked and worked a lot like the mammogram machines doctors and technicians were already familiar with. This example illustrates the same basic pattern that I've found across many different experiments. The path to great ideas is to start with a relatively novel primal mark and then flesh it out with familiar elements. And it turns out this is what Picasso did with Guernica. He ended up doing 55 sketches as he fleshed out his vision for Guernica, and he numbered them. So we know the order he made these sketches in. As we can see, he moves from a conceptual, abstract initial vision to fleshing out this vision with more familiar elements. We can see he's working on a horse and bull by sketches 5 and 6. He continues to experiment with how to approach the horse and bull in sketches 7 through 13. In sketches 12 and 13, he's starting to work on a mother and baby. So he's adding another familiar element into the mix along with the horse and bull. We can also see his signature style coming more into play here more clearly. It's starting to look like a Picasso. By sketch 15, he has a rough draft of the layout in mind, and then he goes back to experimenting with different approaches to the mother and baby, horse, and bull. In the interest of time, we're skipping ahead by 5 sketches at a time here, but the same basic pattern persists. He's using familiar elements to flesh out the novel vision he started with, and he's experimenting to figure out which familiar elements he wants to include and how to approach them. And then we can see the final manifestation of the various familiar elements in his final masterpiece, Guernica. Picasso made a very bold choice by ditching the familiarity of artist studio and committing to the novel primal mark he set for Guernica. He never finished artist studio, so we don't know how it would have turned out, but my guess is it would have been a relatively unremarkable addition to his portfolio, especially compared to the greatness of Guernica. I found in my research that people rarely make the bold choice that Picasso made. Overwhelmingly, people favor familiar primal marks over novel ones, even when they're strongly incentivized to develop ideas high in both novelty and usefulness. And this brings us to an important theme that cuts across both studies we've talked about today. Hit makers are not victims of path dependence, they leverage path dependence. Yes, early events can limit the range of options you have going forward, but this can be a very good thing. Path dependence can remove bad options from your future, limiting you to relatively good options. When recording artists build a novel and varied portfolio early in their careers, they shield themselves from being pigeonholed as they try to sustain success later in their careers. When creators set a novel primal mark and commit to developing it, they limit themselves from the trappings of familiar primal marks, putting themselves on a path toward a great idea in the end. Rather than get disheartened by path dependence, we should be motivated by it. Let me leave you with the eternal wisdom of Shi Tao, from whom I borrowed the primal mark concept. Be highly aware of the first stroke, insofar as it has a determinative effect on all those that follow. Thank you. Thank you again for being here today. And I'm really looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Justin. What a beautiful talk. I feel the round of applause happening, even though we can't hear it on Zoom.
Thank you.
What got you started thinking about all of this through a social scientific lens?
It's a good question. I, became fascinated with people who dedicate their lives to creating things that culture and society ends up appreciating as just, someone who loves the creative industries, movies, music, TV, and then also seeing innovation in technology, and medical domains and other, more technical disciplines. I'm just awed by seeing people come up with creative ideas, and that's amazing in its own right. Going back to the beginning of the talk, just having one breakthrough innovation in one's career should be celebrated as a very successful career. But then the people who seem to do it time and time again, they just amaze me even more. And so I think when I started, systematically studying creativity, it kind of inevitably brought me to this notion of a hit maker and kind of what drives sustained success, because it's so rare, yet we do see it kind of systematically happen in every industry where, yes, most are one-hit wonders, but there's a small group that seems to just be really, really good at this. And so that's kind of what led me to be interested in it. And then, of course, music was an ideal context to look at it in the first place.
Right. Is it, am I misunderstanding your talk to say that, in fact, most creators, like, contrary to the law you shared with us, most creators will be 0-hit wonders? And the 1-hit wonders are pretty rare, and the beyond 1-hit wonders are like the things that the outliers that we really need to study carefully.
Yes. Yep. So in the music context, you know, 93% of artists that are signed and release music with hit labels. So these are labels that have had hits before, right? So they have the resources, the capability, the networks to create, you know, artists who have hits. 93% of the artists signed by these labels will have zero hits in their careers. And then, you know, 7% do. So, and then of that 7%, about half, you know, will only have one hit in their
Yeah,
entire career.
yeah,
So it's, yeah, this is, you know, a very rare feat to even have one hit, and to have many hits is an incredibly rare feat, which is also why, just statistically and scientifically, we need really big data sets to be able to look at this without a lot of bias, because we're talking, you know, to get to that, you know, essentially 3.5% of hit makers, you're cutting down the sample a lot. And so we still had many thousands of hit makers in our sample. But that is an important part of this style of research, to be able to have a large and comprehensive data set.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's such a, and you of course have your finger on such a fascinating question that
Thank you.
so many people wonder about as a part of just the traveling through everyday culture, right? So I love that you bring your scientific lens and this a massive amount of data to investigate the question in new ways. When you think about kind of some of the classic questions about creativity, like what's the role of intuition in hit making versus something more rational in like in your path dependence model?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the my path dependence model is pretty descriptive, right? So it describes kind of what we see systematically happening in this industry over time. It does not get into the nitty-gritty of what enables, you know, for example, one of these artists who build a novel portfolio early in their careers, and despite the odds, manage to have a breakthrough hit. And then, of course, they're more likely, based on my model, to sustain success. That is the role, I think, of intuition there,
Mhm.
and all the everything that we know about the drivers of, you know, creativity and highly successful products, you know, kind of goes into that more micro level story. And I think, you know, intuition, and things like feedback and organizational support and all these things that we know are important from the broader literature on creativity, you know, that plays into that part of the story.
So let's stick with the artists for a minute, Justin. And I have a number of questions for you, but I'm going to defer to the audience because the questions are coming fast and furious. And if you all have a question and you're listening, grab the Q&A panel. You can ask your question. But someone wants to know, from your perspective, aren't some artists hit making um, because they're tapped into something about the era in which they live? And so that relates to your music example, but also your Guernica example, that like somehow there's not just novelty and variety, but there's history, or that like there's a moment in time in there too.
It's such a good question. You know, I think yes and. So I think that you can be too much of your time, right? So the we'll use Picasso. So the Nazi bombing of Guernica happened right then. You know, it probably took a few days for the news to even get to Picasso at that time. You know, because we don't have all of the very fast channels that we have today. So the world was still making sense of this tragic event. And, you know, so it wasn't quite zeitgeisty yet in the way that artists who would score high in typicality in my study would score, which is that their songs sound very similar to what is already popular and kind of been popular over the last 1 or 2 years, right? So it's almost about knowing what's next and making a bet. I mean, I think Picasso did this because he took on the challenge of Guernica because he was inspired and understandably distraught, but he also implicitly made a bet that this was going to be resonate more than what he was working on Artist
Right,
Studio. And so
right.
I think that the artists who are able to pull off this, very difficult challenge of creating something that's really novel, but that also something that resonates, it's not just right now in the moment, it's actually a little bit into the future. And I think that's what we see in the
Mm,
data, and also just
mm,
as I study
mm-hmm,
this, just in terms of reading
mm-hmm.
about case studies and such.
Yeah, yeah, I like that too, being too much of the moment instead of being a part of the sense making of a moment into its future in a way. It's a
Mhm.
beautiful way of thinking about it. All right. So another really important question that I want you to have time so that people can understand what you're trying to tell them more clearly. Um, there's some questions from the audience about how you assess novelty and familiarity. So can you talk a little bit more about your data and how you're working with the data in these two dimensions so that readers can see the rigor of your method, or viewers?
I can talk about data all day long,
I know
Monica.
you
Thank
can.
you. Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity. So I'll do my best not to get too far into the weeds. We built the data set using 5 different sources. The kind of backbone or the foundation of the data set was, of course, the Billboard Hot 100 list and the complete record of that, which songs and which artists appeared in those lists from 1959 to 2010. And then we cross-reference 4 different sources for the actual catalogs to sort of catalog each, the complete list of songs for each of the artists to ever appear in the Hot 100. And those music sources were 2 crowdsourced databases called Discogs and Music Brains, where music enthusiasts and then also retailers upload information on their music collections. So they're very comprehensive, a little bit messier than the other 2 data sources, which were, of course, the 2 companies with the largest collections of digital music, Apple Music and Spotify. So each of these data sources had strengths and weaknesses. The paper is published. It's in Administrative Science Quarterly in 2022. It's called One Hit Wonders versus Hitmakers. You can look it up. It's actually I paid the fee to make it open source, so it's all there. And there's actually a very long online appendix that explains the details of the data collection. But long story short, each of these data sources had amazing strengths, but also limitations. And so by cross-referencing them and using machine learning techniques, what we're able to do is, have a more accurate, more comprehensive list of each artist's songs. Part of that list included data from Spotify that captures important aspects of how songs sound. They're like acoustic or sonic features, things like tempo or danceability is a fun one of these dimensions.
Mhm.
There's also objective things like key, what key the song is in, etc. So there's 13 or 14 of these dimensions that musicologists have kind of agreed upon that these are really important aspects of how a song actually sounds. So every song in Spotify has actually been scored by machine learning algorithms on these 13 or 14 dimensions. And so we take those and we're actually able to use these dimensions about how songs sound that are quantified. And that's how we're able to score novelty and variety. So novelty would just be how similar a song is, or how really dissimilar a song is to the recent hits in the marketplace. So that would be like the 500 or so songs that appeared on the Hot 100 the year before. And the results are robust if you make it 2 years or 3 years or 5 years, whatever. And variety is really internal to the artist's portfolio. And it's how dissimilar are songs in the artist's portfolio to one another.
Thank you for that. And we will direct readers to the paper and make sure when we share the video that we share the open source link too, so people can read more about the data for themselves. One of the questions from an audience member that's getting the most upvotes right now, and it's something I wanted to ask you about as well, is can you do some translation for us from the domains where your studies live that you talked today about into some more day-to-day business or work context so that we could sort of architect for ourselves more chance of having great ideas rather than incremental ideas or bad ideas. And in something like maybe it's strategic planning or decision making, like everyday decision making, how do you extrapolate?
Yeah, I think that so let's start with the Promo Mark study, which I think is much more easy to generalize, right? In fact, the experiments I've run have been in all different domains. I do think the concepts and the findings do generalize to, really any job and any line of work where you're trying to come up with creative ideas. One thing that's important to remember is that not all ideas need to be creative. It's perfectly okay to end up in the or to shoot for the incremental ideas quadrant, which would be lower right hand side.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, like I said, most progress, most innovation that happens in the world is actually from incremental ideas, and that's perfectly fine and actually necessary. It's when, as a company or for you in your role, if you decide now is the time for a more creative idea that is novel, that's going to help, stand out in the marketplace or provide some sort of unique value that isn't being tapped right now, that's when it's important to not get trapped in the incremental path and really commit yourself to a novel primal mark. And
Mm-hmm.
so what I like to say is each new idea does start with a novel primal mark, but that doesn't mean that you need to stick with that forever. What we see creators who are good at this do is they, have some type of intuition that maybe this far away idea from a different domain, from a different industry might have some relevance to, to my domain. They think about it for a while and they work on it for a while. And then sometimes it clicks and they're infusing familiar elements and they realize this thing has legs and I can run with it.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes they realize they're spinning their wheels and they're not getting anywhere and they're just, it's not going to work out. And that's when you ditch it and you start a new novel primal mark and you repeat. I
Oh.
also have some research that, shows um, basically it's almost always a good idea to be developing two ideas simultaneously to some level of maturity where you're then actually able to kind of get external feedback and test them. The reason being is very early on in the creative process, it's very difficult to be able to know which kind of primal mark or initial idea is going to lead to your best final idea. So if you have the resources and time to develop many ideas, great. Most of us don't. Most
Right.
of us are spread thin and busy. And so at least two would be my rule of thumb.
Mm-hmm.
So it's setting two very different novel primal marks, both of which are novel for your domain, for your role, and then really not letting, I think sometimes we all have our favorites.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's, oftentimes what we find in my research is sometimes your favorite early on is actually not the idea that's going to be the best in the end after it's developed. If you, in fact, put equal amount of work into both of these ideas, sometimes that one that you think is a little bit harder and a little bit difficult to imagine how it'll end up working actually overtakes the one that's your favorite. So it's important to really commit yourself to developing these, two novel primal marks into pretty mature ideas so then you can stress test them and get, more feedback, hopefully from multiple different kinds of stakeholders, and then take it from there. So that would be my best kind of actionable advice on that front.
Okay. And one of our audience members, I'm going to guess at the pronunciation, Heinz, is saying that they spent 35 years as an R&D innovation professional, and they saw the tension between that's not new enough and that's too new. And so there's a cultural and an organizational and political overlay to this. How do you grapple with that in the way you do research on the topic?
It's a really important question. I'm still grappling with that. We certainly know from the research on creativity and innovation, this was really where so creativity is idea generation, usually in the scientific literature, and innovation is really about idea implementation or actually getting your ideas adopted and spread and disseminated in the marketplace. We know that a lot of great ideas die in the middle of those two processes, oftentimes at the hands of risk-averse managers. So I have another study I didn't talk about today, back from 2016 on creative forecasting or predicting the success of new
Right.
ideas. And a major finding of that is that actually creators are bad at evaluating their own ideas, which we didn't need more research on. There's all sorts of egocentric biases that lead us to our ideas are right here for us. They're right in front of
Right.
our face, so we can't see the weaknesses and accurately evaluate the strengths. So managers are really helpful for that. They're helpful at maybe killing some ideas that creators are overzealous about. But what we found is actually that managers oftentimes reject what are actually really great, very promising novel ideas because they use sort of outdated criteria to evaluate those ideas. And that the best people to go to for feedback and accurate predictions about how successful ideas will be are fellow creators. So again, you might not be that great at evaluating your own idea, but your peer who's working on their own ideas, they're well positioned to give you accurate feedback about how promising your idea is. And so I think one strategy to potentially overcome resistance at an organization is really actually getting support and buy-in from fellow creators. This isn't a silver bullet, of course.
Hmm.
Managers do have the ultimate power. But if you're getting consensus feedback from fellow creators, both maybe at your firm and non-competitor other firms, that your idea has legs and has promise, that's a really strong signal that should be used and heeded by management. And so that's one potential path.
A question of lots of questions about AI coming up in the audience, but one question that intrigues me has to do with um, would you make the prediction, or is it fitting with your argument to say that across a whole field of innovation, something can serve as like a primal mark? And like, would you say that something like OpenAI's ChatGPT primal mark in the AI space, like unfolds in any particular kind of way? How do you think about entire kind of fields of innovation like this?
Yeah, I love that question. I've been thinking about this a lot recently. I mean, I think sure, yeah, when ChatGPT came out, it then inspired a lot of probably primal marks that weren't as novel as what ChatGPT was to the rest of the market. Of course, there are AI labs that were working on LLMs who are well aware of the capabilities, before us regular
Right.
consumers learned about it. I think that what's important to remember at a bird's eye view about everything that we talked about today is that creativity and innovation are path-dependent processes. So we tend to think of breakthrough innovations as path breaking. In fact, we use that literal word, path breaking. And in fact, they are at the domain level. But for the creator or creators or organization that actually, developed the path breaking innovation, they were on their own path. So you have to remember that to them, by the time they release it, it's obvious,
Right.
So yes, it's breaking the path of the domain, but it's actually just continuing the path that the creator organization was always on. And that's really important to remember because it means that breakthrough, that path breaking innovation, actually was just a series of earlier choices and maybe some happenstance and luck too, that created and sent this, set of creators or organization on its own path. And so for all of us trying to, if our goal is a breakthrough or path breaking innovation, we just need to think about creating our own path and then having, in the end, our breakthrough be kind of obvious to us, even though it's breaking the path that the rest of society, the rest of the domain is on.
Right. Right. I think that description addresses or begins to address another question from Alexander in our audience, who wants to know how you talk about these ideas in the domain of academic research. which seems to be pretty iterative, according to Alexander, with a few pops of novelty. And would it be better if there were more novelty, or how do you talk? How do you talk to academics about their research portfolio in these terms?
This is obviously something I've thought a lot about. I think I've made up a number for how kind of like relevant my music study in that model is to academic life, and that number is 85%. I think
Mm,
the 15% is really domain specific. I could imagine, so I'm not a mathematician. I could imagine, for example, really specific areas of mathematics where maybe you'd be fine like specializing early on and never really building a varied portfolio and kind of focusing on a very specialized domain. I don't really know for sure. That's just my conjecture. But I think that for most disciplines, including my field of management or our field of management organizations, Monica, um, that that's in the 85%. And I do kind of
mm,
I have not tested this empirically. I would love
mm,
for someone to
mm,
test this empirically, including
mm.
the potential moderation by field. I think that'd
Yeah,
be
yeah,
fascinating.
that would be
Um,
fascinating.
but I think that certainly when I'm advising PhD students, I do advise them. That's a great time to pursue novelty and
Right,
variety. I
right,
think that once, if one is on a tenure line journey, once a tenure clock starts, maybe that's when you're leveraging the novelty and variety you built as a PhD
sure.
student. But I
Yeah,
see relatively low risk and potential very, very high upside to PhD students and early career kind of postdoc stage scholars building a novel and varied
right.
portfolio. And I do believe that
Yeah,
would pay dividends. But I
yeah.
do want someone to test that empirically.
Yeah, let's
Uh,
test that
yeah.
hypothesis. It was one of the questions actually that I had was, do your findings change the way you mentor or the way you encourage others to mentor people who are kind of earlier in their careers, right? And like versus at different stages. That makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that's right. I think another thing to note is, when I have presented these findings to, more artistic audiences, there are varied reactions, and one is, that might be a little bit depressing that after you do have your breakthrough hit, that suddenly, because of the pressures, very real pressures, the creative challenges you face are much more narrow, right? So you're boxed in by what
Right.
you've done, you're boxed in by the moment, and I think that I totally get that. I do think that there's two other ways to think about it. One is it's still a very creative challenge. In fact, in some ways, more difficult than the freedom you have early in your career to figure out, all right, how do I leverage my past portfolio and my skills and the expectations that come with that? How do I work in and integrate recent developments from that are created by other creators? I think that's a sort of beautiful and creative
Mm.
challenge. And at the
Mm.
same, so then the second way to think about this is if that's not appealing to you, that's totally okay. And then you just need to make a decision of whether you're okay with a more niche audience, right? So
Right.
my model is about having a very broad, very big, commercially successful audience and sustaining that, which is a very big feat to pull off. But that's
Yeah.
not the only way to a happy and successful life. You can have a niche audience as long as you keep that audience satisfied. You
Right.
should be able to food
Right.
on the table and these sorts of things.
Exactly.
So,
Yeah.
some artists very deliberately make the choice to abandon the broad audience, and that's perfectly okay. And that's perfectly okay in academia too, right? I mean, some people do make that choice. And so I think what my model helps do is make clear that it is a choice and you can go either way. And this is the rewards and the potential risks as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that, Justin. It made me think of the work of Marcus Collins, our colleague in the building, and his book For the Culture, which he's talked about on Positive Links. So, viewers, if you don't know what I'm talking about, go back in the catalog a little bit and listen to Marcus talk about his work. And part of his talking about how people are continuously or need to be, if they want to be doing this, continually listening to what's going on in the niche culture or in the space where they want to be moving into. And it relates to a couple of studies that are coming up, or studies, a couple of questions coming up in the chat about how do you see the role of human-centered design and listening to more stakeholders as related to this novelty, familiarity trade-off and managing the trade-off?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the design thinking method is I really appreciate, and I'm not an expert on it, but I'm a fan. And I think that it can work for both the incremental quadrant and the you know pathway to the sort of great ideas creative bucket. I think one thing to keep in mind is if you do kind of go out and look and do human-centered design, chances are you probably will end up in the incremental bucket unless you're deliberate about seeking a novel solution.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
there's no reason why you're preordained to end up in the incremental bucket if you are using a kind of design thinking or human-centered design approach. But I would conjecture that if you're not deliberate about making sure that you're setting a novel primal mark, that you're on average going to end up there. But you can still use all those techniques in terms of, looking for human needs and plenty of breakthrough ideas have come from a design thinking approach. It's just something to be mindful of. I think it's complementary to what I'm putting forth here, but it doesn't change the fact that you have to be deliberate about committing yourself to a novel primal mark where you don't know how it's going to work out. And then you can go out and use all of the kind of techniques of interviewing people and to flesh out the idea. But if you don't set that novel primal mark to begin with, I think you could fall into the trap of kind of with a more incremental idea, which again
Yeah.
is perfectly fine and could actually be the optimal solution for a given problem. But that's something you have to decide at the outset.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. We only have a couple of minutes left in our conversation, and I think there are some Justin Berg fans and super fans in the audience. So one person wants to know, and this may be wild, so you can say no.
I'm game for wild,
um,
but let me
is
take a sip of water first then.
is there a way that you could set a more novel primal mark that would change the way you would do job crafting and make your job crafting more creative? And I know that person is a super fan because they're blending two big parts of your research stream into one really interesting question.
I love that. I mean, yes, I think I actually think that so Jane Dutton, Amy Resnesky, and I have a line of research on job crafting. We also have a tool called the job crafting exercise that's in partnership with CPO. And I think part of what people do in that exercise, not everyone, but I think once in a while, what happens is, so you end up, it's a process where you take your values and your strengths and your passions, some important aspects of you, and then you try to create a vision of diagram of your job to better suit your values and your strengths and your passions. And I think what ends up happening is someone will think of a strength, like let's go with creativity. They're a really creative person, and then they'll look at their job and they'll have all their their diagrams set out um, with the job crafting exercise, and they'll realize like there just isn't that much room for creativity in this job. What are some ways I can, change my tasks, the way I think about tasks, forming new relationships to allow creative avenues in my work. And so a lot of times it's the important aspects of us, our values, our strengths, our passions that kind of inspire a novel primal mark within the context of the job, and then they're actually able to come up with a plan for executing on that with our tool. So no, I love that, and I think that that's part of what's happening with this diagramming process and this visual way of thinking about our jobs is it ends up inspiring a lot of primal marks.
Well, Justin, I want to thank you so much for the conversation and the wide range and variety of topics that you talked about today in a short period of time, and the fascinating work. And thank you for coming back home to the University of Michigan to inspire us all.
Thank
And
you.
thank you, everyone, for the great questions that you asked today. And we really appreciate the time together.
Thank you so much, everyone. I loved your questions. Thank you.